appreciative that everybody could be here again for a great speaker series event again. We've just had a fabulous summer this year, and continues tonight. Before I go on, though, I want to mention we have a special guest in the crowd that hasn't been here for a couple times. They finally kicked him out of the hospital. They were tired of him. And so Peter Wagner is here tonight. Let's give
Yay! Yay, Peter!
We're really excited about the speaker series here. You know, the Okoboji magazine, Discover magazine, all the magazines up here are the Wagners help publish and dispense around the area, and we're really happy that they sponsored this program. And they put together another great program this year, and I know they're already talking about next summer as well. So without any, well, one other thing I have to say, while you're here tonight, the Pearson Lakes Art Center, I know you all love history. A few years ago, we decided we needed to capture the history of the Pearson Lakes Art Center. And that started before COVID, and we knew of a great local author that could do the research and find a lot out about the history. Well, this is before COVID. Jonathan researched before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And we now have a history of the Pearson Lakes Art Center when it first started as a shed, then down at the little red gallery down in the area by Tweeters, all the way up to the beautiful facility we have here today. Since we have so many special guests, this book is normally $40. Tonight it's $30. There's some out here, and Jonathan will be glad to sign those. So make sure you stop and take a gander. It's really a history of the whole area, not just of the Art Center. So it ties right in. So without any further ado, let's give Jeff Wagner a great big round of applause.
Thank you. On behalf of my father, I really want to say thank you, Jonathan. When this season started this summer, the spring, my father came to Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, could you help me with this?" Not knowing that he was going to be sick most of the summer and unable to attend. As we just heard, he spent 5 weeks in the hospital, got out last Friday, and did a funeral on Sunday, so how's that for crazy? But Jonathan, thank you so much. Like so many things you do, our first day we appreciate you. We're looking forward to tonight, and I'm not going to say much other than that, other than thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, thank you. Yes, with my great speaking voice here, which I do not have. So that's why I get the microphone that I get to hold right up to my face the whole time. So you won't be seeing too much of me behind, except for the microphone in front. We have in front of us here two people that are really going to help us guide us along. What the roadmap is for tonight, we want to be able to tell you, to educate you, to entertain you about all the great things that happened when the Iron Horse came to Dickinson County. And to do that, we've got probably, Don, I don't want to embarrass you, but the foremost authority on railroading in the upper Midwest, Don Hofsommer. Teacher, professor, numerous articles, about 37 books, Don, or I'm sure it feels like that. But many books as well about railroads and railroading in the upper Midwest. It's a subject that obviously is quite near and dear to his heart, and certainly something you have passion about. And we're glad to have you here. And then we have Mary Dreier. Everyone knows Mary is the director of the Dickinson County Museum. You've seen her on MC22. You've seen her on Jeff P's videos. She is pretty much everywhere on the digital airwaves. The one great thing about Mary that I can tell you is that not only does she know a lot, but she can schmooze better than anybody I've ever met. So.
And Jonathan, I just have to say that tonight I'm here for comedic relief
and
storytelling.
So now we know what's going on. So by all means, if you want to hold the microphones, because we're going to start talking now, guys, believe it or not. What I've done here is I've created, in the slides behind us, just a series of photos of contemporary and historic photos relating to railroading in the county. I'm going to leave them running. Maybe they'll spark some questions for you when we get to the near the end. So we'll keep them running and be able to generate some more interest, visual interest, besides looking at us. So, but the first thing I want to do is turn to Don. Spend a couple of minutes, if you can, Don. Paint a picture for us of railroads and railroading as it's spread across Iowa. The major players, we're talking post-Civil War, I would assume, up until the time, and then even beyond, when the railroads came to our county in, what year, quick? 1882. 1882 when they came here. So, when I think of railroading in that part of that century, I think unbridled competition, I'm thinking land grants, I'm thinking communities with railroad fever, and I'm thinking of communities saying, pick me, pick me. How did they get all that done? Over to you, Don.
How many in the audience rode a regularly scheduled passenger train in Dickinson County?
One,
Two of
two,
us.
three, two. Wow.
There's this old, rotten story. The train just left, said one person. The other person asked, how do you know? Well, it left its tracks. Well, in Dickinson County, there's only a sliver of track left over Superior. So it's pretty abstract tonight to talk about railroads in Dickinson County. But in fact, Iowa and the railroad industry grew up together. Chicago was the spark plug, as you might easily guess. Railroads emanated from that place. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, Chicago and Northwestern, Chicago and Alton, Chicago and. But many of those lines from Chicago headed west. And by the first days of the Civil War, railroads were at the Iowa frontier, across from Burlington, across from Dubuque, across from Marquette. And one, the Rock Island, had penetrated the territory, as it were, with a bridge over the Mississippi River. Well, the Civil War shut down construction, as you might easily guess. But then in 1862, during the war, when Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act, the impetus was, since the Railroad Act said the beginning line of the transcontinental would start at Council Bluffs, then there would be, in the post-Civil War era, a race to Council Bluffs. The Burlington, the Chicago Northwestern, the Rock Island were the first three to Council Bluffs. But later on, even the Wabash and the Illinois Central and the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago Great Western. The point I'm making by indirection is that the grid of Iowa was a horizontal axis leading from and to Chicago. The exception to what I've just said was the Milwaukee, or what was called the St. Paul at that time, which started at Marquette and worked its way west to Charles City, Mason City, Algona, Spencer in 1878, and then beyond to Dakota Territory. What explains this little stub from Spencer up to Spirit Lake? Do you think there's freight revenue on that 20-mile stretch that would adequately justify that? Maybe initially, when you think of the millions of board feet of lumber alone that had to come to construct the towns of Fostoria and Milford and Arnold's Park and Okoboji, not to mention Spirit Lake. Yeah, and then what about the hardware? Sure, short term. I don't think the freight there was going to be adequate long term. So what then might have driven it beyond freight revenue? Well, look at a map, and what were the recreation opportunities? or amusement opportunities. I can't think of any except the Prairie Oasis of Dickinson County. In other words, what the Milwaukee and the BCRN managers were thinking was, we have to have something that attracts people here, makes them happy to be on those farms in these small villages. You can't measure that. I can't prove my thesis here. But I think that was in part, that was part of their thinking.
But in general, do railroads make more money from freight or from passengers?
Freight pays the bills.
Freight pays the bills.
Freight pays the bills.
So this was all just a little bit, they were going after the icing on the cake then, to try to get that done.
Yeah. Now, sometimes the icing was rather impressive. For instance, I know one case when Milwaukee ran 2 special trains into Arnold's Park, each carrying about 1,000 passengers each. That's impressive. Net revenue, who's to know?
So the railroads then, you mentioned attracting people to come here. We know that they had to advertise, and especially the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern relied heavily, my research has told me, on the Cedar Rapids Gazette, but being the hometown newspaper for them. But also, what did they do, Mary, to attract people?
They wrote booklets, for one thing, advertising how wonderful this area was, how it was a place to get away from it all, to rest and relax in beauty. And when they wrote of these areas, of this area in particular, they didn't talk kind of straight like you and I talk. They had a lot of flowers in their speech. And I wanted to add to what Don was saying about the rails coming into Spirit Lake. Hunting had been a huge occupation around here even before the Spirit Lake Massacre of 1857. Hunting was a big deal here. We don't often talk about that. We think that the Gardners were the first settlers here. Well, prior to them, there were hunters and fishermen. This area was already known as an oasis, a natural oasis, a natural, a really desirable place to be.
So we had the lakes, we had sloughs, we had wetlands, all of which attract wildlife, either the kind that swims or flies in.
Right, and the wildlife attract people here.
Okay. Go ahead.
Speaking of wildlife,
I can see how this is going to go.
some of those who came to the lakes from outside carried moral values that were a little bit different from the values of those who had come to live in Spirit Lake. And the editor of the Beacon paid attention to that sort of thing. And there was the predictable tension between those who were here, the residents, and those who came with their curious moral standards. Wildlife.
I think what you're alluding to is the huge investment that the Burlington had in the Hotel Orleans. The Grand Hotel Orleans, over 400 feet long, 3 stories, 7 spires, enabled all kinds of views for way into Minnesota when you were on the roof. But they catered, as my understanding is, to the wealthy of the upper Midwest. That's who they wanted to attract, because guess what? They could pay the bill to get there and enjoy themselves. But the problem occurred almost immediately, didn't it, with so-called blue laws and prohibition.
And there was that tension, and then the low water years of the 90s and the awful depression of the panic of 1893. It had a dampening impact overall. Before we leave that, it is worth remembering that St. Louis was a target for the railroad companies advertising this part of the world, this wonderful lakes area, the salubrity of its climate, no mosquitoes.
They'd never been to Minnesota then.
They said. But the St. Louisans did come here in droves to the hotel.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and the wonderful thing about the Hotel Orleans, wonderful thing, sadly, as Don alluded to, the engineers and the surveyors picked the place in between Big Spirit and East Lake. They figured this is ideal location. You can look north, you can look south. We've got the spit of land on the isthmus. It'll be an ideal location because we can easily bring the railroad tracks through here. They liked flat ground, naturally. It's a lot easier to try to get a railroad track going on flat ground. So coming in there, then they hired, or they forced. What's the word I'm looking for here? They empowered J.L. Hardwick, who was the master builder of the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern Railroad, to build a grand hotel on the isthmus. And it had every modern convenience that you had at the time. It had its own gas plant, so that you could have your gas lights. Before long, it had its own telephone and telegraph system. But what the engineers did not know is that they had picked a year that was high water, and that practically every year thereafter, for 10 years or more, Spirit Lake dropped its level, and they literally thought it was going to dry up.
At the museum, we have a poster board that has a picture of the original Orleans Hotel, and it was absolutely magnificent. It had turrets at the top. It had promenades all the way around. I think it wasn't it like a half a mile of promenade?
Yeah, 14 feet wide, so the two or more couples could promenade and stroll at the same time.
And each of the rooms had two doors, one leading out to the promenade deck and the other an interior door. This was a place, that obviously the more wealthy people came. But yet, in the advertising brochures for the area, they speak of the Orleans Hotel and the Lakes area as a place for the common folk to come. They wanted to make sure that everyone wanted to come here. And one of the ways they did this is they really emphasized how restful the space was, and yet how you could discover wonderful bays and points of land, and the fishing was tremendous, and everything was absolutely perfect here. It was like the best place in the world to come.
I'll put you on the spot. What kind of language did they use to communicate that? You've got some in front of you.
This is actually from a book written in 1889 by the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern Railroad. The lakes themselves lie in a wilderness of sweets, to use the imagery of Milton. In summertime, these great undulating prairies through which you ride are billowy with ripening wheat and tasseled corn, or like the changeful sea, they sweep away in green blessedness, only that their ripples bear to the tired senses the sweet odor of herbage for the fattening of unnumbered thousands of cattle. Brooks like rifts of silver water, the thirsty expanse, and towns busy with the stir of active life dot the line, pleasant abiding places in a fair land. Everywhere you see the expansive roofs of substantial homes, the broad, generous fields, the smiling crops that reward the husbandman. And while you are absorbed in the picture of typified peace and abundance, you reach Spirit Lake.
Oh, we're not even here yet.
Well, and then it goes on to say, the great Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern System taps 100 lines of road, which will bring you within reach of this delectable place.
My heart swells. So I don't know until I'll ask Don, what impelled communities such as Spirit Lake to try to bring the railroad in? I've heard the term railroad fever. Were there taxes? Were there land grants? Were there kickbacks? How did they manage to get that done?
Kickback. Remind me to come back to that topic.
Okay.
But Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern, the very name of that company suggests that I am wrong in my horizontal axis network. Well, this was an exception. The line was, in fact, built from Burlington to Cedar Rapids to Waterloo and so on, and then finally up to the Twin Cities. But from Vinton, there was this spur that ran off to the northwest to Clarion, Isle Falls, Clarion, Emmitsburg, Esterville, and Spirit Lake.
Right.
Burlington Cedar Rapids Northern connected with an allied line of the Burlington route at Burlington, so that people from St. Louis could come to Burlington, BCRN, then to Spirit Lake. So, and that became part of the Rock Island, a term that you'd be more familiar with. Now, as to the land grant, I think which you were sort of implying.
Right.
The land grant, the federal grants of land to railroad companies cover about 10% of America's rail miles. Most of them in the American West. Well, think, for instance, St. Paul to Tacoma. I don't know, lots of miles, about 1,800 miles.
Exactly.
Through an area that was not inhabited other than by natives, that was at one time called the Great American Desert. Now the land grants, there was a grant of land that went to the railroad companies. The railroad companies could then say to bonding companies, all right, here are some assets. We can pledge these assets against the bond. And then they used the bond money to build the railroad. The government kept every other section of land. So the railroad company got one, government kept one, and so on. Now, in the case of the Northern Pacific Grant, that was 18 miles on either side of the railroad. That sounds huge, and it was.
It does.
But think what we're talking about in the Great American Desert. But those lands nearest the railroad, once the railroad was construction, what happened to the value of the land that the government held? It went up. The net was, it was about a wash. It was about a wash. And then, under the land grant from the federal government to the carriers were obliged to carry government freight at a reduced rate through the Second World War, as it turned out. Can you imagine the savings to the United States government during the Second World War, when the railroad industry handled more than 90% of troop personnel and material? So, there's a lot of argument about the land grant, federal government giving these things to the railroad company. Well, there was something in return.
Right.
That's the
Certainly.
part we don't hear about.
So this, yeah, the quid pro quo was never really articulated much. All I know is that my family settled in central Iowa because some maiden aunts had railroad stock, and they ended up with some property as a result of that. When either cashed in or went broke, or they ended up with property because of one of the railroads at that time. And
the nearest land grant here would be the line that runs through Sibley and Sheldon.
yes,
From Lyndon down that way, that was a land grant, and the one from through Spencer. That was a land grant. It wasn't 18 miles, it was more like 6 miles on either side. You mentioned railroad fever.
yeah. What was that about?
Well, if there was one thing that folks wanted in the 19th century, it was railroad service. And if they didn't get it, they're going to be really in tough shape. And as a consequence, if there was an established community, they really wanted to attract the railroad. And the railroad may or may not choose to go to that community if there was some kind of bond incentive. That could be at the township level, it could be at the county level, it could be at the community level.
Okay.
It happened that way. But in other cases, the railroad had its own interest, and maybe it would sponsor its own town site. That happened not so much in Iowa, but certainly as we get west of Iowa.
Well, the effect of a railroad coming in, I think that can be seen in Milford.
That's just what I was going to say, Jonathan. We have an example of this right here in Dickinson County. The town of Milford actually started out south of the town that we know today. There was a mill southeast of of Milford and the railroad decided, well, that's where the original town of Milford was. The railroad decided to come further north into what later became known as North Milford. The town wanted to be on the railroad line, so the town of Milford actually moved from its original location further north to what was called North Milford to what we call Milford today because of the railroad.
And one of the photos that we have circulating here is when it shows a higher view of a railroad train crossing what's now Highway 71, about ready to make the turn and head up to the lakes across diagonally, about where the South Casey's is today. A fun historic photograph to see. But when the railroad came, I think as one of the videos, one of the screenshots shows, the newspaper said, "Oh, we have our second railroad." Everybody jubilant. And this is because, as Don pointed out, suddenly you had access, both incoming and outgoing. I can tell you that when the Milwaukee Road came up, what do you call it, 20 miles from Spencer to our depot up here, what do you think the very first structures built were? Was it the depot? Was it a hotel next door? No. The first structures built were pens to hold livestock and a few sheds to hold things that could otherwise get damaged or stolen. In a matter of days after the railroad got through, instant commerce, just like that.
And competition.
And
Now you've
competition.
got two railroads experimenting.
And that's a whole other issue as well. I'll let you speak to that. And why the heck didn't they ever join up? They had a stupid turntable to the north. That's what people ask today. Why didn't they join up? They don't understand. Well, because there were two railroads. The first one was the Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and Northern. It came around through the south of the Spirit Lake, curved down, and then went west. And then a few months later, the Milwaukee Road showed up, and they got up to where our depot is. And then just a few hundred yards farther north, they put in a round table so that the locomotive or cars could head back south. People today don't understand that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not quite sure. The Milwaukee and the Rock Island never had an interchange track in Spirit Lake.
Never.
And the reason for that was you didn't want to short haul your own railroad. So they didn't have a connection. It's worth also remembering that at one point the Milwaukee expected to go beyond Spirit Lake to Jackson. That never happened. Why Jackson? Because there was another Milwaukee road horizontal through that part of southern Minnesota.
Yeah, you want to connect with your own railroad,
Yeah.
not with somebody else's. Yeah.
Short Oregon.
Yeah, today with our roadways, we think, well, why didn't they just build it over there, and then you could go wherever you needed to. Competition, competition, competition. Awesome. What were some of the things, Mary, that I mentioned the pens, the livestock pens, so the farmers and other people could send some of their livestock out and also receive livestock, old livestock, and grains and coal and everything else. What are some of the other things that we can tell people that immediately became available at that time?
Well, one thing that we were talking about on our way back when Wednesday group yesterday is something I've been thinking about a lot in regards to tonight's talk, and that is back in the 1870s, between 1873 and 1877, there was a severe, horrible grasshopper plague. It was so bad that the sky turned black. It was so bad that for 4 years there were no crops in the area. For 4 years people had no seed to plant. For 4 years people were short of food. It was a horrible time here in the area. And what I've been thinking about, again, this was 1873 to 1877, it was before the railroads came to the area. And in my thoughts, I've been thinking how different the outcome of that grasshopper plague would have been, perhaps, if there had been rail traffic in and out of the area at that time. to bring in needed supplies, needed seed, needed food, needed everything. But there wasn't at that time, so it was devastating. Many farmers lost their farms at that time. They just could not keep them up.
Well, and let's not forget also that even if you were a farmer hoping to sell grain, you kept some for yourself for two reasons. One, to be able to plant again next year, and also perhaps to feed your family. And that's why we had the mills down in Milford as well. They were grinding grain into flour so that you could eat. Yeah, it was definite hardship time during the grasshopper plague.
But again, I think that if the railroads were an issue here in Dickinson County at that time, it may not have had the far-reaching consequences that it actually did.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then also, even though Don says that freight pays the way, it was the ability to become a tourist, both incoming and outgoing, that I think not only put us on the map, but it introduced local residents to the rest of the world. One of the first, I was looking for pictures and news clips to put up there. It was a matter of days after the BCRN came to Spirit Lake, they started promoting, you can now catch a train all the way to Minnesota, to eastern LeClaire, I think was the town, somewhere over there, on the Mississippi River. Days. And guess what? The newspaper reported so-and-so took a trip over to, perhaps to try to do some business, or maybe just because they could. It's hard to imagine when the roads were as bad as they were in those days, and horse and buggy was the rule, what the railroads brought in terms of access and speed.
It's difficult in the extreme for us in our time to identify with that time. People were absolutely dependent on the railroad for transportation services. If you were going to go somewhere, you went on the train. If you were going to ship something, you shipped by rail. If you mailed a letter, it went on the railway post office car. If it was a piece of express, it went by Railway Express, or the predecessor. It was absolutely dependent on the railroad industry. It was the first major American business, the railroad industry. And as a consequence, it tended to shape everything, including your daily life. Everybody at that time was touched one way or the other by the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
I found a postcard on eBay. I collected area postcards for decades. And I happened to see this postcard listed on eBay, and it said, Peter, Mama will be down on the 1:15 train tomorrow. Now, I thought, ooh, Peter, that sounds like it might be my grandfather, and it was. I bought the card, and on the card it said that Mama was going to come on the 1:15 train tomorrow. But think about it. That postcard went to Milford, where my grandfather lived, from Spirit Lake, day one. Day two, Mama came on that same train. I mean, everything was done by the railroads.
And not only that, but you ended up with the value of virtually instant communication, not just through mail, which used to take weeks in some cases. Now you could receive or send a letter in mere days. As a matter of fact, I think that still is in effect, isn't it? But send a letter to anywhere in the U.S. in mere days. But then, coincident with the coming of the railroads was Western Union and Telegraph, the email of the day, so to speak. And
well, you think of traveling salesmen.
Oh my goodness.
The traveling salesman might come out from, let's say, Des Moines, and he stopped at every station and got his orders, took his orders to the depot, handed the orders to the telegrapher, who sent the wire to the wholesale house. That next day, the wholesale house filled those orders, put it on the train for delivery. And then there are other kinds of stories about the traveling salesman.
Well, thank you. How many of us saw at the Okoboji Summer Theater The Music Man? A bunch of us. Okay, that very first scene with the traveling salesman. with them bouncing in their seats, recreating without moving
You
on
gotta know the
stage.
territory.
Yeah, you gotta know the territory. I mean, that was absolutely true with those traveling salesmen. Another thing that was often overlooked is just before the very rousing Wells Fargo wagon is a-coming, what's the first line that they say? I just heard from the depot. The Wells Fargo wagon is a-coming. So in those days, Wells Fargo was your Amazon.com of the day, and the depot was their warehouse, so to speak. I mean, all those things that we can look back on today, but they were vitally important to a small and growing community.
That depot had its agent, or telegrapher, or agent telegrapher, and he was the first person in town to know the latest news, whatever that news might be, because it came over the wire. It was, the markets came that way, any kind of weather forecast came that way. During the Second World War, of course, the nasty messages from the War Department that so-and-so had died at Iwo Jima, and then was called to the depot agent to deliver that telegram to the recipient. The depot agent was a figure of importance in any community.
And did you know, Don, that at the Milwaukee Depot in Spirit Lake, the first telegrapher, the first depot agent, was a 16-year-old girl named Eva Ballou. Her father was actually supposed to be the first depot agent, but he was in ill health and had to go away for treatments. And so Eva became the first depot agent. Eva was here in 1883. Our depot was completed in 1884. And so she spent the year of 1883 living in one of the freight shacks outside the depot. There's a newspaper article from the early Beacon that says, and Eva, on the eve of the completion of the Milwaukee Depot, and they would, of course, use flowery terms about how wonderful it was for the community, and that Eva got to move into the Milwaukee Depot, which was certainly palatial after being in the shack.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, it had heat. It had probably running water of a sort. No, not then? But, yeah,
Didn't have running water till 1932.
Well, I mean, what do you call that?
A pump
A
thing.
pump, yeah, pump handle. But she had a sink, probably. But she definitely would have had heat, and also lived upstairs. That's where the families lived in the depot from 1884 until
About 1952 or so.
1952 or so. That must have been a very interesting life. We had a speaker a few years ago, one of the descendants of a depot agent. Okay, did you happen to review that tape before tonight to see what? Okay, I was blown away. Okay, the depot agent, yes, he has an ear tuned all the time for the telegraph. Has to write down everything incoming and outgoing. Has to sell tickets, and you think that's what the depot agent does. Turns out, no, they were. You see some of these guys on the thing here with the overalls, the dirty, oily, sooty overalls. They pulled those on and then they'd go, move the train, turn the train, come back here, perform maintenance on the locomotive, move the cars around. I mean, these people were busy, busy, busy every time a train came up the tracks. I had no idea. That was a learning thing for me. And it made it clear that I did not want to be a depot agent in my next life.
One thing that I've discovered about depot agents and railroad workers in general is that it was often a family affair. It seems as though if your father worked for the railroad, there was a good chance that you did also. And I found this to be true in my own family. My paternal great-grandfather was an engineer on the BCR&N line, and he had 8 sons. They were all workers for the railroad, different lines, of course, but they all worked for the railroad. The same thing was true for the Dyson family that worked out of the Milwaukee Depot here. H.B. Dyson was the depot agent. His son Robert also became a telegrapher and later depot agent and later an engineer, not like a trained driver engineer, but an engineer for the Union Pacific. And so it does tend to run through families. And I do have to just say this little thing. My great-grandfather was an engineer for the BCRNN, like I said. And I had always thought in the back of my head that I had heard someplace that he drove the train up here. I found an article from the Milford Mail. It says, Mr. Cutting is well known among railroad men throughout the Midwest. He ran the first engine into Spirit Lake when the old BCRNN Railroad was built, and he held a perpetual pass over all the lines in the Midwest. So, okay, the same guy supposedly was the last survivor of the charge of the last light brigade. That was found to be false. He was also the oldest man ever to ride in an airplane. He rode in a Donaldson's brothers stunt airplane in 1882.
Not 1882.
No, not in 19, I mean in the teens, 19 teens, something, probably 1919 or so. He obviously was not the oldest person to ever be in an airplane at that time. So you have to take...
Never let the facts stand in the way of a good story.
Right. And he was a master of that. But he was an engineer for the BCRNN, and all of his sons were involved in the railroad industry also.
I think, Don, you could probably speak to having railroading in the blood. When it gets in there.
Or cinders in the blood.
Or cinders. Yeah, you know, we romanticize so much about the old days, how grand it must have been. And it was, no doubt, it was a step up from horse and buggy. It was faster. But if you open the windows, a lot of times you'd get cinders and soot coming in the passenger cars. The tracks were not always perfectly maintained, and they could only put so much, I don't know the technical term down, your lengths of rail were only X number of feet long, so that you ended up with the for hour after hour after hour after hour. But at least you got to Des Moines. But Mary, you've got a couple of stories that have turned up on way back when Wednesdays about usually youthful people with the locomotive that might have been left unattended.
Oh,
Do we think that's a true story?
Yes, I should have brought a film clip of this.
Yeah.
There have been several instances over the years that may not have necessarily been documented, but the stories have gone down about an engine being left on the tracks with the engine running, and a depot agent's son getting in it and racing his beloved girlfriend to the next crossing, and then backing up so nobody would know that he'd done the same thing. And I've heard that a local hotelier from days past did the same thing back, I don't know, 1940, 1950, something like that, and again was never caught, only this guy made it all the way from the Milwaukee Depot down to McDonald's and had to back up and pass away, and nobody ever knew he did it, except now we know.
Well, was that the one that was done kind of on a dare? I think he said, I bet you can't do it. He said, well, okay, I'll show you.
Yeah.
Teenagers, gotta love them, right? Yeah, I know, and the other story that I had heard was that, we think of the so-called hand cars that allow the track crews to move quickly and easily between places, that some local teenagers, and this was late in the memorable, people alive today can talk about this. They found a hand car, put it back on the tracks, found it was still working, and decided, let's take a trip to Lake Park. And so, two guys are busy, humping it back and forth, never knowing if or when a train could be coming.
I'm a little suspicious of that hijacking a locomotive, but hijacking a motor car or a hand car?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh yes, that happened.
That's one thing that we're going to get to in a little bit here. I had the privilege of riding on a steam locomotive earlier this last fall, and happened to be that guy who buttonholed one of the engineers. And I asked him a whole lot of questions about how to run it. And there were two locomotives side by side. One was an Alco from Schenectady, New York. The other was a Baldwin. And I peeked in one, and I peeked in the other. They didn't look anything alike in the engineers. So I asked him to explain it to me. get to share my learnings on this because it was so exciting. I had no idea railroads would order their locomotives specifically according to their needs or their perceived future needs. You know, we're going to have the big boy Union Pacific Railroad locomotive come through in September, come through Iowa. And that was for a specific need to haul long trains, you know, over great distances. You didn't need that for coming 20 miles from Spencer to here. But the knobs, the dials, the levers, the things you have to watch, opening the grate if it was still coal-fired, or turning the gauges for this to make sure it was oil-fired, that it was still going. And oh, if your tracks are slippery, how do you get going again? Those little domes on the top of the locomotive, they hold sand. I never knew that. You know, and so that's it. They drop the sand down in front of the wheels, which is metal on metal, they need traction. You can learn so much when you go on a train ride. What else have we got here that we want to make sure that people understand? You know, for a community, it was the difference between, I think, life and death over the long term, and I think they saw that back in the day. My little quip, it's not really a joke around here, but that joke is that around here, if the railroads hadn't come to Spirit Lake or the Iowa Great Lakes, you know what we'd be? We'd be Moon Lake, which is a lovely place, but nothing happened up there. You know, and so it's the difference between something happening and something not happening.
And another example in Dickinson County are the towns of Hagerty and Wallace. The rails didn't go through either of those towns. Have any of you been to Hagerty and Wallace? Mm-mm. They're gone.
They're out there far away from the railroads in the southwest part of the county. And yeah, exactly right. Your town will literally dry up and blow away unless there's some reason for it to continue to exist. One of the things that I think I want to move to here, if you can, you've been watching these lovely photographs. I'm going to exit this for just a moment. And I'm going to I'd like for you all in the audience to imagine bringing our depot to life. Now, one thing about our depot, our original 1883-84 depot, it is the museum's, the Historical Society's greatest artifact. It's our biggest. It's also hardly even changed. If you haven't been in our depot in recent years, heck, even if you haven't been in there in 30 years, you could walk into the waiting room and it would look the same as it did back in those days. But it's a great historical artifact. And so one of the things that we on the museum board, Mary has her company shirt on tonight, is we want to bring the depot to life. You know, as we've talked about here for 45 minutes, imagine no Arnold's Park, no Milford, no Crescent Beach or Manhattan, no amusement parks. You know, think about that. Why do we have Arnold's Park where it is? Because Wesley Arnold, who had a place there, saw that these railroad guys were coming through and they needed a place to stay. It started with him letting out rooms in his house, and then he added on to the house. Then he built a hotel. And then to make sure people came, he built a water slide. And bingo, you have an immediate amusement park in the beginning of the town in Arnold's Park. So with this, you get growth, you get stability. I'm not really exaggerating when I say that the railroad was the 1880s Internet of Things of the day. So now is the time, it's a really great time for us to tell the story. I don't see any teenagers in the audience, which is a darn shame, because now's the time to start telling the story to them. And we have a way that we're working on to tell that story. So imagine you're entering through a portal to the past. If you've been to our museum, you have our brick building, and then you have our original depot. The little space in between, and by the way, you can jump in and take over anytime. And the little space in between will be created to be a portal to the past. It's going to look like a passenger car, a Pullman car. It will have video screens showing what it looked like looking out the windows as you went from Milford or Arnold's Park up to Spirit Lake. you'll hear the, you know, and the steam engine doing its thing. And then finally you'll pull into the depot at Spirit Lake. So then you walk through and you'll be on the depot platform. And so with this, we will be presenting a recreation of our boarding platform. We'll introduce you to some of the early visitors. We have photographs not shown here. The luggage. Take some of our artifacts and show people, what did people travel with in 1890 and 1900? For heaven's sakes, it's a lot different from today. Children will get to learn how to operate a real steam engine, and it's a lot harder than you'd think. With all those knobs and gears and levers and valves you have to make sure are open and closed in just the right way. So then, we'll talk around a little bit about how our communities grew. We've talked about railroad fever. And how many knew that we had 11 depots, early stopping places in the county? 11! And how many are left in their original locations today? 1. That's our train station, our train depot up here. And, you know, as we talked about, they brought goods, they brought communications, they brought services. And we're going to be presenting that in an interactive, hands-on way. And then as you go around a corner, you'll be able to plan your own train ride. Where would you like to go? Des Moines, Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, LeClaire, Wisconsin? We'll figure out a way to get you there because we'll have maps that'll allow you to interact. You could go up to the our original unchanged ticketing window. Even today when you go in, if one of us happens to be attentive to little kids, we will stamp a ticket for them. And we're going to be doing that. And you'll see that not only will they get to do that, but we'll make sure that they can also learn about depot operations. Yes, you're going to get to play with the telegraph keys that we have. Those of us who are old, what the heck's a big deal about a typewriter? Oh, but if you put that in front of a 9-year-old, suddenly it's rick-a-tick-tick-tick-tick. They will type letters all day long. It won't make much sense, but it'll be a lot of fun for them. And we'll have all kinds of interactive things like that for the kids. Lots and lots of fun. And then the station master, the depot agent, the typewriters, Morse code. We hope to be able to incorporate a little Morse code learning kiosk where maybe kids can send messages to each other. And then for me, as you stand in that, as you look out the window toward what would be Northwest Bank, we're going to have a full-size locomotive screen in the window. People forget how big these things are. And it's going to look like it's just 6 feet outside of that window waiting for you to hop on. Very impressive looking.
You're doing great.
Apparently I'm doing great. That's good. And you know, we will have the telegraph sound throughout the whole day. Every one of our stations here will have a soundscape so that you'll hear the telegraph key. You'll hear a depot operator calling down to find out whether the train's going to be on time or whether it's going to be late. People calling in. Eventually, we're going to have you, went too far, you'll be able to meet the 16-year-old Eva Ballou, and we're going to have her tell you about what it was like living outside in the little sheds during her first year until the depot was actually built. And we'll have her telling about perhaps how she learned Morse code, and I think we'll find out it was because she had to. 16 years old. I don't know any kids who could learn Morse code and actually be a credit to their age. So it's going to be very exciting. And then you'll exit to the Midsummer Paradise that Mary has talked about here. We'll have brochures and posters, and we'll have soundscapes in that area where you'll hear rowboats with creaking oars. You'll hear a quiet lapping of Big Spirit Lake as it rolls up against the shoreline. You'll hear rowboats. You'll hear steam whistles, not just from the locomotive, but from the steamboats, like the original Queen that plied the waters of Big Spirit. And it will really, really be an opportunity to learn more about this fascinating, exciting railroad history that we all share here. So why am I telling you all of this? We are trying to raise money. We have a fundraising goal to bring the depot to life. We've set a budget of $250,000, which by Okoboji standards really isn't much around this area, but we are off to a good start. Mary, we're 50%-ish.
Just about, yeah, we're just a tish over 50%
Yes.
right now.
So, I mean, look at the interest that the community has.
And Jonathan, don't forget, we have a matching grant challenge going on right now.
Please explain that, yes.
We have an anonymous donor who is willing to donate $10,000 if we can come up with an additional $10,000 through donations by Labor Day. So the time's pretty short on that. And so it's a great time because any donation you make right now is doubled.
So $10 becomes 20, 100 becomes 200. I won't say 5,000, but we wouldn't turn our noses up at that, would we? So, but either way, I mean, so the clock is ticking on that. Mr. 21st Century here, that would be me. There it is, a QR code. If you have your cell phone with you and you'd like to learn more about that or make an actual donation, that takes you right to our website so that you can do that.
And we also have brochures that you can pick up.
On your way
George
out.
Kuhey from the Higgins Museum is graciously agreed to pass out brochures at the end if you're interested. And also we have membership brochures for the museum.
Oh, we love
available
members.
too. Yeah.
We love members. Okay, I guess it's time for Jeff to come back. You get to field any and all questions that people may have. I'll give you the microphone and let you move around as needed.
Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Well, we'll come right up here. Yes?
I don't need a mic. Will you guys tell us with those pictures where they are that you've been showing? All of them.
Oh, the historical images you mean?
Yes, all those photos.
Identify the pitches, yeah.
Every 67 of them?
Especially the depots. Where were the old depots? The aerial depots?
Let me see if I can go back and bring that back up.
While you work on that, let's take another question.
What is that?
Okay, right there. Okay, right there, you're looking at Milford, headed south. That road on the left is Highway 71. The locomotive is crossing at what today would be the Casey's. Can you imagine that? The Rosa W was Carl Wollenberg's launch that was brought up here in 1905. That's taken at the Milford Depot on the Chicago and Milwaukee Road. The Milford Depot, not a glamorous looking photograph.
Tell us where that was.
It was right, well, it's right where there's construction going on now. Catty corner from the Three Sons. There's a big open space there. And that's where the railroad went. And if you were to follow that, the bicycle trail from Arnold's Park down into Milford, you'd be looking right at the depot. Now Lake Park that we have here, you can, I think the grain elevators are still there, so that you can see where everything was. I believe they moved the little depot house there over to the west. That right there is Arnold's Park, the railroad right-of-way. You can see the Hilltop Lounge up on the right before that burned down, and on the left where the car is the Emporium. Superior, well, what can you say? Superior, Superior. Also Superior. And then we'll come back to you in a moment, Jeff. We'll do a few more and then I'll pass it back to questions. And then that, I believe, also, is that the photo that you took, Don?
Yes, that's the last upbound passenger train from Des Moines.
Okay. Love that car in the background. Okay, and then that's the Superior Depot as well. It looked, I think, just like the one that was in Spirit Lake. And you're going to ask me where the Spirit Lake Depot was. Anymore, it's like, imagine if you will, because it's just on a curving area of the new bike trail to the northeast of Ivy.
You're talking about the Rock Island.
The Rock Island, yeah. Yeah, can you imagine crossing that grade? Wondering if our train is going to come, you know, with the gravel. There's a little news thing on Eva. 29 seconds, there we go. And then the little train or thing by the station agent's head, that actually was just a little sound multiplier. That so that when he was working around, it would amplify the click click of the telegraph so that he could hear it. And then that's our depot right now. Okay, the Milwaukee Road is putting up the Okoboji station. At one point, especially after the Inn Hotel was put in, one news article, I couldn't find it, but I remember reading it, said that it was probably the busiest Western Union station on the line because of all the telegrams going to and from the Inn Hotel, as well as regular business. The refrigerator car from Rock Island Line up by Orleans Hotel, sending ice out of here. Okay, we'll come back to some of those. Other questions, please?
I live in New Orleans. It's 1890. I want to come to the lakes. How long is it going to take? What's it going to cost? And is it true the train has to stop every 7 to 10 miles to recharge the water?
That sounds like it.
The last part first, no, it didn't have to stop at every station to replenish the water supply. Coming up from Des Moines, if you can think of present-day Waukee, it doesn't, to me, Waukee does not look today like it looked in my youth. But Dallas Center, Perry, are you following me? Okay, that line would take you to Ruthven in 1890, and there you would have to change trains and come over to Spencer, and then up to Spirit Lake, and the elapsed time would be about a half a day at 3 cents a mile. But the watering places on the line I just described, you would have found one at Dallas Center and Gowrie and Mallard.
And how long would it take to replenish water?
5 minutes.
When you're saying a half a day, are you saying 12 hours?
Yes, yes, yes. Now later on, if you'd gone to 1900, for instance, then there was a narrow gauge line from Des Moines to Waukee to Adel, Jefferson, up to Fonda. And in 1899, the Milwaukee Road bought that, standard gauged it, and extended the line from Fonda to Spencer. So that now you can get on a train at Union Station in Des Moines and be in Spirit Lake in about 7 hours, 6.5 hours. Later on, at the end of the passenger service, you left here at 6:20, I think, p.m., and you're in Des Moines at 12:05.
And just to add to what Don's saying, we have a plaque at the museum that advertises a cheap excursion to Spirit Lake and Okoboji on Sunday, June 20th. Now, I don't know the year, but I'm guessing 1900 or before. And this is on the Milwaukee Road. And the special occasion was a grand sacred concert by the Chicago Rush Quartet and Mandolin Club. Somehow mandolins and sacred music just don't jive with me. Anyway, this special excursion came from Mitchell, South Dakota to Spirit Lake. It would leave Mitchell, South Dakota at 5 a.m. and arrive in Spirit Lake at 11:20 a.m. for a grand cost of, are you ready for this? From Mitchell to Spirit Lake, $2.25.
I'd like to pick up on the water and stop taking water. I heard a description several years ago. I heard it secondhand from what was supposed to have been a railroad presentation, that they didn't always have to stop. They had some way of scooping up water. Can you expand on that? Or?
Yeah, that was on the New York Central from, let's say, Buffalo to Albany, something like that. And there was, it had to be perfectly engineered, and the engineer of the locomotive had to be perfect in his handling. But there was a scoop under the tender that at speed would, you literally scoop that water into the tender. That was on the New York Central. I think that was the only place that happened.
Not common
no, not at all, not at all. Some of you are familiar with Spencer during the steam engine years. When the train from Spirit Lake came down a little before 7, 22 came in from the west. Both noses of the locomotive stuck out onto Grand Avenue. And if you're southbound, you had to go around the nose of those locomotives because that's where the water tank was, not the tank, but the spout. And so the locomotives would stick out there, much to the consternation of motorists. It was wonderful.
Others?
I've got a question over here. You take that out, show them, kind of look at it, and all that, and then tell the audience what it is. It's an 1884 trade schedule, Spirit Lake.
Gee, I'm sorry that everybody happened to see me receive this. Check that out.
You can take it out of the wrap and look inside.
Very nice. What it is, can you just describe it?
Your mouth.
It's a glorious lithograph, first of all, of the Orleans Hotel in the front, put out by the BCRN Railroad by C.J. Ives, who is the general superintendent, and B.F. Mills. And just a little side note, when the Orleans Hotel was built, C.J. Ives' wife made sure that there was a chapel within the Hotel Orleans, and visiting preachers would come and preach on Sundays. But then, in addition, there's a little piece of flowery language about the joys of being in Spirit Lake. And then there's also the timetable showing routes from Clear Lake to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and the rates. The rates range from, to go to Hot Springs, Arkansas was $41. To go to Clear Lake was $9.35, if I'm reading this correctly. Am I done? Well, anyway, it's got the rates here. This is really, really, really cool. Oh, and there's artwork on the back of a young woman, and it says compliments Iowa route. This is priceless.
Very nice.
Any other questions?
How important is the relationship between coal and trains in the development of this area, as an energy source, I assume?
Oh, that dirty old coal. But you're absolutely right that there was an absolute correlation between the railroad industry and coal, not just in consumption, but in hauling. For instance, in 1936, during that nasty winter, in 1936, houses were heated by coal, schools were heated by coal, manufacturing plants were heated by, or used coal for every sort of energy, and the locomotives were powered by coal. So the correlation was great. And Iowa, you may remember, was in fact at one time a rather important coal-producing state. It was high sulfur, but it was available, and it was greatly desired. As a matter of fact, James J. Hill, from Great Northern Railway fame, in St. Paul, actually put money into coal fields in Iowa, down around Perry. Not so long ago.
And was the demise of coal as an energy source also responsible for the demise of railroads?
No. No, actually, when the coal miners went on strike in 1946, that accelerated the dieselization of the railroad industry. It actually hurt the coal miners.
I have one comment. $1 in 1900 is worth in today's money $37.45.
Yes.
This is just railway in general, but back in the day, what was the purpose
purpose of the caboose? Because I loved watching that when I was a kid, and what did away with them?
Well, the last part first, there was absolutely no need for a caboose in the modern era. The caboose was a rolling office for trainmen. Typically, during the era you're speaking of, there was a 5-man crew. In some states, there were state mandated 6-man crews. Locomotive engineer, fireman, head brakeman, all on the locomotive. In the caboose was the hind brakeman and the conductor. The conductor ran the show. He was the boss. The hind brakeman worked the back end of the train. The head brakeman worked the front end of the train. Hand signals, lit day and night. But the caboose was also where, in some cases, the crews stayed overnight. They had a stove in there, not only for heat, but for cooking purposes. And some of the trainmen were really good cooks, some were not. There was a place for ice to cool the water and keep your lunch buckets cool. It was a rolling office. But with radios and centralized traffic control and other modern devices in the railroad industry, they were absolutely obsolete. And incidentally, it was hard running, there's slack on the train. And you could really get bounced around in the caboose, so there was a safety issue too. Oh, safety. You're supposed to look out the window and see if there are any hot boxes. On a 100-car train, no, the modern era, they were absolutely romantic, but obsolete.
My dad was a signalman for Chicago Northwestern.
A signal maintainer?
A signalman over there.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. So I remember seeing him get on that.
Yes, sir. Were there any major train accidents at that time around this area?
Around this area? I'm not sure, well, I don't know is the short answer. The longer answer is there was an epidemic of derailments, and I think it was February of 1952, maybe 3. There was a terrible head-on collision south of Sheldon. A passenger train ran head-on into a snowplow extra, killed the locomotive engineer, and on the passenger train injured several others. The same night, I think, a northbound plow train from Spencer derailed near Phillinworth. And what happened was the flange cups iced up, and the plow in front of the locomotive did a jackknife, came right around and hit the locomotive and derailed it. And a couple of days later, there was a terrible accident on the Illinois Central. Newell put 16 cars of refrigerated meat in the ditch. I'm not sure if they qualify as really serious, except that one over at, I forget, Hospers, between Hospers and Sheldon.
Any other questions? Yes, we'll just take a couple more. So we'll start over here.
I live on Lakeshore Drive in Arles Park, and the tracks went through there. Have you seen pictures? Were there 2 lines, which you just spoke about, or was it just one? And when did that get taken out?
1974, I think, was the last trip up to Spirit Lake and back.
Right, and the photograph at the end here that showed our depot when it was painted red, and then there's a train car in the foreground. Mary just told me that that was on the occasion of the tracks being removed up at Spirit Lake. So they probably would have started there and then worked their way south back to Spencer.
We had a question over this side. Yes.
Where was the New Orleans, the big New Orleans hotel?
Where was the big New Orleans hotel?
The Big Orleans Hotel. Oh golly, I love that hotel so much. Look at that. 400 feet long, 3 to 4 stories high, big dining area over there on the right. It had, in addition to those walkways, it had electric empowered annunciators to let people know when you had called, i.e. visited or wanted to visit with people. It was totally modern in every respect. Where was it? The spillway, yeah, the spillway drive, I'm gonna go back to this. If I can find it, just stop it. The spillway drive-in would be, come on, one more. Oh, now you're gonna hold up, huh? The spillway drive-in would be, oh, just about where that triangular thing is. That would be the entrance to the spillway drive-in. So it covered a huge amount of real estate on the north side of the road. And on the other side would eventually, well, at that time was also the fish hatchery, which still exists today.
Not a bowling alley.
I think they had just about everything or anything that would attract customers.
Even an orchestra.
The Orleans Hotel even had an orchestra of their own.
Fascinating. Well, I'm honored to be able to say that my father has a few things he wants to say at the very end. The man that started this many, many years ago and has driven this for many times. You want to finish?
Well, there's just about 3 things I'd like to share. Number one is, if you're really fascinated by the history of the Milwaukee Railroad, there is an organization, a historical society, to which I belong. The spring issue did a marvelous feature on Spencer and the Milwaukee coming through Spencer and the blizzards there during that time and the difficulty they had getting up into Spirit Lake. And so there's an article this time that connects out of Canton, South Dakota, and a renewed depot that's been built down in Elder, Iowa, Elder or something like that. Big, beautiful museum put down there. So if you like railroads, the Milwaukee Railroad Association has a wonderful historical group. So does Chicago Northwestern. Union Pacific has a half-heartedly one. Rock Rapids, it's just a little loose litter. There's not a nice magazine, but not Rock Rapids, Rock Island, excuse me. But there is a way to connect more with railroad history if you're fascinated by it, which I am. So if you want to touch base with me, I can tell you how to touch base with those, or just go online and look up the different historical associations. But Milwaukee does constantly, and their magazines come back from reference areas close to us. That's number one. Number two, the other railroad that we have to take into consideration when we consider the development of the Iowa Great Lakes is the Chicago Northwestern, or the old Sioux City and St. Paul that came out of Sioux City up into Sibley. Dr. R. Brown of the Okoboji Bible Conference, when he was still alive, told me that his dad and others out of Omaha would get on the train down in Omaha in the Chicago Northwestern and ride it all the way up to Sibley. And then there was some kind of a motor convenience there that would pick them up and bring those Omaha people over here. And that, I think, was part of what helped create Omaha Beach. And then thirdly, going back to Wayne, to Reed, excuse me. That's what I want to throw back to. Reed, yes. We talked earlier this spring about this new amalgamation of museums that you have. And I want the people here to hear a little bit about that. And then I want to tease them with the idea that next year we're thinking about doing a 4-part program called Mysteries from the Museum, where we would ask each of the museums involved in this group to bring 2 or 3 things, maybe 2 or 3 different museums each time. Bring 2 or 3 different things from the museum, set them on the table and say, what is it? And then continue to tell us about the history and the background and how that is relevant to us here at the Iowa Great Lakes. So Jeff, if you give the mic back to Reed, maybe he could talk about that. Jonathan?
Peter, I'm very happy to talk about the Lakes Area Museum Alliance. It's a consortium of the 13, believe it or not, 13 museums in Dickinson County who have formed an alliance to work together to elevate each museum individually and the museum world in Dickinson County in its entirety. We work together. We put a promotion out again this summer. If you visit 10 of the 13 museums and get your little llama card signed, you can enter a drawing for a fabulous prize. You'll be hearing more and more about the
Lakes Area Museum Alliance.
Exactly.
I get it now.
Exactly. And we are under the auspices of the Spirit of Okoboji, who supports us in many, many ways. Be looking for more good stuff coming from the Lakes Area Museum Alliance. And I love your idea, Peter. We're game for it.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Peter, and everybody here coming here tonight. Went a little longer than we normally do, but I would say it's because we have a lot of interest, and that's good. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. As you leave, if you care to grace us with a membership to the Dickinson County Museum, George will be at the bottom of the ramp outside. And also, if you'd like to learn more about our depot project, he can pass off some information at that time as well. So thank you very much for coming. It's been very good.